3. Time and History. Clarke's study of historiography shows an interesting ambivalence in the attitude of humanism through the centuries towards history. The Greeks, on the whole, took little interest in history, whereas the Egyptians had a keen sense of time. The Enlightenment despised the past and was so superior to antiquity that history had nothing to teach. Voltaire held that no secure historical knowledge could be obtained for events prior to 1600. According to Clarke, the 19th century, on the other hand, saw an intense interest in history return, and this interest is widely present in the 20th century. The extremes of opinion concerning time and history have been especially prominent in the 20th century, and their presuppositions have been more readily apparent. The humanistic problem has been the chronic disease of all immanentistic faiths, an all-or-nothing expectation of time and history. The transcendental, absolute, and sovereign God of Scripture having been denied, time and history become the only valid arena of meaning. The result has been this ambivalence between a pessimistic rejection of time and history as meaningless and an insistence that total meaning is something to be derived from them. The secular doctrine of progress was one version of this humanistic faith. The secular doctrine of progress was a secularization of the biblical doctrine of providence and of biblical eschatology. Spencer, in his Social Statistics, held that progress is not an accident but a necessity. As surely as a blacksmith's arm grows large and the skin of a labourer's hands become thick, so surely must the things we call evil and immorality disappear. So surely must man become perfect. As Clarke points out, negatively, progress is the denial of divine providence. Positively, it is held to be a law of nature, and therefore necessary and inevitable. Progress, however, is an idea which humanism must renounce as it departs progressively from a biblical faith. To affirm itself, humanism feels the need of affirming progress. However, as it affirms man, humanism is less and less tolerant of affirming even nature as in any sense governing man, so that, instead of progress and evolution making man, the newer faith becomes man makes himself. And man makes history and progress, not nature. The doubts of the older humanism concerning progress came clearly to the surface in Tennyson, who tried to blend a form of Christianity with the substance of humanism and progress. In his poem, The Play, the tension reveals itself. He wants a governing God, but his God is remote, and his hopes in him are problematical. Act first. This earth, a stage so gloomed with woe, you all but sicken at the shifting scenes. And yet, be patient. Our playwright may show, in some fifth act, what this wild drama means. In other words, there is no meaning now, although a possible fifth act might reveal one. In Memoriam 131 gives us Tennyson's Hope concerning God and the fifth act. The God, which ever lives and loves, one God, one law, one element, and one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves. One element, hints of pantheism. In any case, the possibility of hope is entirely future. The reality of time and history is perpetual flux, as in Memoriam 123 reveals. The hills are shadows, and they flow from form to form, and nothing stands. They melt like mist, the solid lands, like clouds they shape themselves and go. This is an evolutionary picture of a shifting, changing world with an endless history of change. The escape from an unending history of perpetual flux becomes that one far-off divine event, the possible fifth act of history. Tennyson's perspective makes clear why apocalyptic thinking revived as the ancient pagan doctrine of evolution revived. The escape from perpetual flux, from the endless cycle of history, is sought in an apocalyptic destruction of history. Biblical eschatology is not apocalyptic in this sense. It sees not the destruction of history, but its fulfillment in time and then at the end of time. The end is not a violation of time, but its culmination. The humanistic all-or-nothing views of history thus rest on a faith which denies a sovereign God and replaces him with sovereign man. The resultant view of history is an act of faith, and what constitutes a fact is determined by faith. Citing Clarke again. Or, to go back to the first example of disagreement between historians, why did the 19th century deny the existence of the Hittite nation? Certainly, it was not because of any new evidence previously unknown. The explanation is simply that the earlier centuries, by and large, accepted the Old Testament account as correct, whereas the 19th century assumed that the Old Testament must be adjudged mistaken unless proved innocent by independent evidence. Then, since there was not such evidence, it followed that the Hittites never lived. In the face of such factual disagreement, one is forced to examine the processes of historical scholarship. These are clearly not infallible, and accordingly, one must consider how an historian goes about his business. What are his methods? How does he try to avoid error? Where do the difficulties lie? And can the historian avoid theological or other presuppositions? No historian or scholar in any area can avoid presuppositions, as the work of Cornelius Van Til clearly demonstrate. With respect to history, not only are certain presuppositions implicit in all historiography, but those presuppositions include certain expectations. People who study the past are those who are interested in the future. They seek a pattern, meaning, and direction in time and history by examining what has gone before. The historian records a pattern which he sees in terms of a faith. That pattern helps him make predictions concerning the future, and is a possible instrument by means of which he can control that future. The humanist McHale, while abandoning a belief in the inevitability of progress, is interested in the future because he wants man to control it. Our view of the future is no longer that of a great evolutionary onrush, largely independent of man's intervention, tinged variously with doom or elation. We realize, for example, that man does not, in the end, master nature in the 19th century sense, but collaborates within the natural world. His very existence depends upon an intricate balance of forces within which he is also an active agent. In this sense, man's future may be literally what he chooses to make it. Moreover, the outcome of the future chosen will depend, in turn, on our ability to conceptualize them in humanly desirable terms and our willingness to engage with prediction. There is, in this sense, no future other than as we will it to be. If we conceive of a future state as desirable, we tend to orient ourselves toward it and to initiate the courses of action necessary to its attainment. Of course, willing a future connotes more than wishful thinking. It involves an action-oriented commitment to the future in ways that transcend past constraints and present obstacles. McKeel further states, "The future of the future is therefore what we determine it to be, both individually and collectively. The future is a world problem. There are no local problems anymore, and it means that the resources of the planet can no longer be possessed by individuals, corporations, or national groups any more than these can possess the air we breathe. As a result, the old moralities are now devastating immoralities. The future is compounded of past and present. The past is constantly recreated in the future. Past, present, and future commingle in any one conscious instant. Most of our social institutions and processes are designed not only to regulate the present, but also to transmit past values and useful experiences into future forms. Each institution has its own miniature utopia. For McKeel, Christianity has been a religious and social movement, profoundly altering history. Since the Renaissance, and especially since the French Revolution, which McKeel views favourably, history has had a different impetus and perspective. Thus, very clearly, McKeel's view of the past is not the view of the past of Christian orthodoxy, and thus his views of the present and the future are radically different. As a result, while we can agree with him to a degree that man makes the future, we must add that this is only true in a secondary sense, under God and His decree. It is emphatically true that every institution and every idea is a plan for the future. A home, a book, a school, an interest in and study of history, all these things and more have as their purpose the prediction and control of the future. When Christian parents and schools train their children in biblical faith, they do so because they predicate the sovereign God and affirm that the future is determined by His will. Man must therefore conform himself to God and be reformed by Him in order to have an enduring stake in the future. Non-theistic education, governments, and science assume the contrary. Man's future depends on an abandonment of restraining moral and religious premises, which supposedly hamper man's progress. If there is no law or God beyond man, this faith is likely to prosper. If not, its course is in collision with God's purpose and faces inescapable disaster. Man can make the future under God as a secondary cause, and his every act has implicit in it a faith about and a plan for the future. Man cannot be interested in the future unless he has such a hope, nor can he then be interested in the present because his entire life is meaningless. Let us illustrate the difference between McKeel's and other humanists' past and the past as seen by biblical faith. Modern textbooks in world history begin with evolutionary presuppositions. They discuss prehistoric times and sometimes the life and mind of prehistoric man with no visible evidence. They speak of prehistoric man and the animals, long epochs of development, and are sometimes quite specific about unknown things. Thus, an older and more conservative textbook of this kind stated, again, with respect to man's economic progress, his methods of getting a living, we may divide his career into 5 stages. 1. The hunting and fishing state. 2. The pastoral or shepherd stage, 3. The agricultural state. 4. The handicraft state. And 5. The industrial state. This, of course, is simply an evolutionary faith read back into history. No evidence exists for any such, quote, development, end quote. On the contrary, some of the earliest known cultures give evidences of very great advances, including modern plumbing. Ancient maps reveal seamanship only recently rediscovered, and a knowledge of geography presupposing worldwide exploration. Man appears on the scene of history fully man, and with an awareness of things which diminishes instead of increases in later centuries. We have chosen a routine example of the humanistic view of history in Elson. Let us examine a similarly ordinary example from the Christian perspective, Haskell's chronological survey of history, designed, like Elson's work, for school use, and published in 1847. The first entry in Haskell reads, BC 4004. The world created near the autumnal equinox on Sunday, October the 23rd, according to Archbishop Ussher's Annals of the Old and New Testament. 5872, according to the Septuagint. 4700, according to the Samaritan text. Adam and Eve created on Friday, October the 28th. The chronology here followed is that of the Hebrew Scriptures, which is generally regarded as the most correct. The difference between this and the Samaritan text, and that of the Septuagint, relates only to the different lengths assigned to the lives of some of the patriarchs, and is productive of no change in regard to other events. The fact that some scholars of the Hebrew text have differed with Ussher's date by a few years is irrelevant to our purpose here. What is important is that a history whose past includes and is grounded on God's creation has a radically different view of the present and future than does Elson. Moreover, such a view of history presupposes the Bible as the first and only infallible book of history. It is also history which gives us the direction and framework of all history. Creation is followed by the fall of man, and history then reveals both the outworkings of the fall and the development of redemption. The flood destroys the original world and brings a reduced life and world to man. The covenant people are given God's law as a way of sanctification and the sacrificial system, pointing to Christ as their salvation. The various political systems of the covenant bring both good and evil, making clear that man's hope is not in man, nor in politics, but in the Lord. History is declared to be a continual shaking, so that the things which cannot be shaken may alone remain. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 25 to 29. The goal is the kingdom of God, and, finally, the fullness of the new creation. Between these two views of history, there can be no legitimate reconciliation. Both clearly indicate that our view of the past and present is important, not only in establishing our view of the future, but in bringing about that future, whether as judgments or blessing. Deuteronomy chapter 28.